I know.
Do you understand what I'm saying? You're not free to leave? You're not free to leave? 268, can you show one male detained? So what were you doing that was so important to leave your daughter in
I didn't leave my daughter in the car. You keep saying I leave my daughter in the car. I didn't leave my daughter in the car. I came and I put her on that seat.
Video begins in a register of urgency that feels almost ordinary. Raised voices, hurried movements, a small crowd forming around a locked vehicle. Yet within these first moments, the foundation is laid for a much more consequential encounter. What appears initially as a welfare check rapidly becomes an investigation, and then almost imperceptibly a detention. The transformation is not marked by sirens or commands at first, but by tone, by framing, and by a gradual narrowing of options for the person at the center of the scene. From the outset, the situation is emotionally charged. A child is involved. The environment is a gas station, public, exposed, loud. Officers arrive responding to a call for help, not a report of a crime. That distinction matters. In policing, the legal authority available to officers is deeply shaped by why they are there in the first place. A welfare check grants broad discretion to ensure safety, but it does not automatically authorize criminal investigation or detention. What unfolds in these early minutes shows how easily that boundary can blur. The father presents himself as someone who made a mistake and immediately sought assistance. His behavior is anxious, defensive, and inconsistent, but not unusual given the stakes. He attempts repeatedly to clarify the sequence of events, emphasizing time and intent. The officers, meanwhile, are trying to assemble a narrative that makes sense of what they see. A child in the front seat, signs of distress, substances in the vehicle. These two perspectives never quite align, and that misalignment becomes the engine driving the escalation. One of the first critical shifts occurs when the conversation moves away from the child's immediate physical condition and toward the circumstances that placed her there. The officer's questions begin to circle around responsibility, judgment, and credibility. Each clarification offered by the father is met not with resolution, but with further probing. This is not inherently improper. Officers are allowed to ask questions, but the nature of those questions begins to change. They are no longer simply assessing safety. They are testing for fault. This is where power dynamics quietly tilt. The officers begin to speak not just as responders, but as arbiters of reasonableness. Small discrepancies in the father's account, whether he stepped away briefly or returned inside, whether the seatbelt was secured properly, whether the keys were accessibly treated as indicators of negligence rather than confusion. In high-stress situations, memory is rarely linear, yet the expectation imposed here is precision. Any deviation becomes suspect. As the focus tightens, environmental details take on heightened significance. Items inside the vehicle previously irrelevant to the original are reframed as hazards. The presence of substances becomes central, not merely as contraband, but as potential vectors of harm. The analysis offered by the officers expands rapidly from what is known to what could hypothetically be true. Possibility is treated as probability. Risk is spoken of as though it has already materialized. This is a pivotal analytical point. Policing. Doctrine distinguishes between articulable facts and speculative danger. Reasonable suspicion must be grounded in observable, specific circumstances, not worst-case scenarios. Yet here, the rhetoric shifts toward what could have happened, what might be in an item, what you never know. That language is powerful because it reframes uncertainty as justification. It allows authority to expand in the absence of concrete evidence. Simultaneously, the father's attempts to assert his role as a parent, as the one who called for help, lose traction. Each time he challenges a characterization, the response is not to resolve the discrepancy, but to reassert control over the narrative. Officers paraphrase his statements in ways that subtly alter meaning, then proceed as though those paraphrases are settled facts. When he objects, the objection itself becomes another marker of unreliability. This pattern where explanation is interpreted as evasion common in escalated encounters. Once an officer begins to suspect misconduct, every subsequent interaction is filtered through that suspicion. Neutral details become incriminating. Emotional responses become indicators of guilt. The encounter stops being collaborative and becomes adversarial, even though no formal accusation has yet been made. What makes this transition particularly consequential is that it occurs before any explicit detention is announced. The father is physically present, emotionally invested, and increasingly constrained, yet not officially not free to leave. This gray zone is where many constitutional issues arise. People often comply with directives because they believe they must, even when the legal threshold for compulsion has not been met. Authority is exercised first in tone and posture, only later in words. The officer's internal communication reinforces this shift. As they speak to each other, their language becomes more declarative. Interpretations harden into conclusions. A version of events emerges that prioritizes officer inference over the subject's account. Importantly, this version is constructed in real time, without forensic confirmation or medical assessment. It is built on assumption, pattern recognition, and professional intuition, all of which can be useful tools, but also sources of bias. Another escalation point arrives when the encounter broadens beyond the initial concern. The scope expands to include not just the child's welfare in that moment, but the father's overall fitness, decision-making, and environment. The presence of additional items in the vehicle becomes evidence of a larger pattern of irresponsibility. Each new element compounds the previous ones, creating a cumulative case that feels overwhelming to the person on the receiving end. This is how systems transform isolated incidents into comprehensive judgments. No single factor, taken alone, might justify detention or arrest. But when layered together, so selectively interpreted and framed, they can create an impression of inevitability. By the time formal authority is asserted, it feels less like a decision and more like a conclusion that has already been reached. The moment chosen as the opening hook captures this transformation with stark clarity. In a brief span of seconds, the encounter crosses an invisible line. The language used is unambiguous. The father is no longer a concerned parent at the scene of an accident. He is now a detained individual. The declaration does not emerge from a sudden discovery or a new fact. It arises from the gradual accumulation of interpretations that preceded it. This is the authority shift that defines the entire case. From this point forward, the interaction is governed by custodial logic. Compliance is no longer optional. Explanations no longer function as defenses, but as statements that can be weighed against the constructed narrative. The father's agency narrows dramatically, even as the consequences of the encounter expand. Crucially, this dissension occurs before any definitive determination of harm. The child's condition, while a source of concern, has not been established. as injured or impaired. The risk remains hypothetical, yet the response becomes concrete. This asymmetry between certainty and consequences at the heart of many misuse of authority cases. The law demands thresholds for a reason, to prevent possibility from becoming punishment. As the scene continues beyond this point, the earlier choices made by the officers begin to constrain all available outcomes. Once detention is declared, disengagement is no longer an option. De-escalation becomes structurally difficult. The system now requires follow-through. Reports must align, charges must be justified, decisions must be defended. What began as a call for assistance has been absorbed into an enforcement pipeline. This first part of the documentary is not about assigning moral labels. It is about understanding process. It shows how rapidly an encounter can move from care to control, from concern to custody, without a single dramatic turning point. Instead, it is a sequence of small decisions, individually defensible, collectively transformative. By examining these early minutes closely, we see how authority is not simply exercised, but assembled. It is built through language, framing, and the strategic use of uncertainty. And once assembled, it becomes difficult to dismantle, even when alternative interpretations remain plausible. In the next part, we will follow the consequences of that. Authority shift, how the logic established here drives the investigation forward, narrows the interpretation of facts, and sets the stage for outcomes that extend far beyond the gas station parking lot. Once the detention line is crossed, the encounter enters a fundamentally different legal and psychological phase. What matters now is no longer whether the situation could have been handled differently, but how the authority already asserted reshapes every interaction that follows. The officers are no longer evaluating options. They are validating a path already taken. From this point forward, the system begins to close in on itself. The father's responses change almost immediately after detention is declared. His tone becomes sharper, more insistent, not because he has suddenly become uncooperative, but because his margin for influence has collapsed. Before detention, his explanations at least held the possibility of reframing the situation. After dissension, his words exist in a narrower channel. They are recorded, assessed, and potentially used against him, but rarely allowed to alter the trajectory. This shift illustrates a core dynamic of custodial encounters. Once a person is told they are not free to leave, the presumption subtly flips. Officers may still claim neutrality, but the operational mindset is now oriented toward justification. Each subsequent fact is unconsciously filtered through the question: does this support the detention we have already initiated? Evidence that complicates that answer tends to lose weight. We see this clearly in how the officers revisit earlier details. Statements that were previously ambiguous are now treated as admissions. Inconsistencies are no longer signs of stress or confusion. They are reframed as indicators of dishonesty. The father's attempt to clarify the sequence of events is met not with reconciliation of facts, but with insistence that the officer's version is the authoritative one. Narrative control has shifted decisively. The scope of concern continues to widen. What began as a question about a locked car becomes an inquiry into parenting decisions, substance storage, and environmental safety. Each of these elements is discussed not in isolation, but as part of a cumulative pattern. This aggregation effect is powerful. It allows officers to argue that even if no single factor is dispositive, Together, they demonstrate neglect. From a legal standpoint, this is where standards matter most. Child neglect statutes typically require more than poor judgment. They require a demonstrable failure to provide necessary care or protection. The difference between risk and actual harm is critical. Yet throughout this phase of the encounter, the hypothetical danger continues to be treated as sufficient grounds for enforcement action. The language used emphasizes what could have happened rather than what did happen. The introduction of additional hazards amplifies this logic. Items found in proximity to the child are described in ways that heighten perceived threat. The discussion moves quickly from presence to potential use, from access to catastrophe. This rhetorical escalation does important work. It converts uncertainty into urgency, and urgency into justification. Notably, the officer's framing also shifts responsibility backward in time. Decisions made earlier, how the child was seated, where items were placed are judged not based on outcomes, but on hypothetical worst-case scenarios. This retrospective reasoning allows present authority to be anchored in past choices, even if those choices did not result in actual harm. It is a common feature of enforcement narratives, and one that courts often scrutinize carefully. The father's attempts to contextualize his actions are increasingly dismissed. His explanations are acknowledged verbally but discounted substantively. Phrases signaling understanding are followed immediately by reaffirmations of concern that override that understanding. This creates an interactional paradox. He is told he is being heard, while simultaneously being shown that being heard changes nothing. Psychologically, this is destabilizing. Compliance becomes fraught because cooperation no longer promises relief. At the same time, resistance risks being interpreted as further evidence of irresponsibility. The subject is trapped between two equally unfavorable interpretations. This dynamic often produces emotional escalation, not because the person is irrational, but because the structure of the interaction leaves no productive outlet. Institutionally, the officers are now operating under their own constraints. Once detention is declared, disengagement requires a reversal that must be explained and defended. It is easier procedurally and psychologically to continue forward. This is not necessarily malicious, it is systemic. Policing organizations reward decisiveness and penalize perceived backtracking. As a result, early judgments tend to calcify. We also see how inter-officer communication reinforces this process. As officers brief each other, details are streamlined. Nuance is lost. Interpretations are shared as settled facts. Each retelling sharpens the narrative edge, removing ambiguity and highlighting elements that support enforcement. By the time decisions are discussed aloud, they feel obvious, even inevitable. This is particularly evident when the focus turns toward formal charges. The language used becomes legalistic, categorical. Options are presented as binary. Either action is taken, or an unacceptable risk is tolerated. This framing obscures alternative responses that might exist between those extremes, such as referral to social services without arrest, or documented warning coupled with follow-up. The presence of the child continues to anchor the officers. Moral authority. Any challenge to their approach can be framed as indifference to safety. This is a powerful rhetorical shield. It discourages scrutiny by positioning enforcement as the only responsible choice. Yet the law does not operate on moral intuition alone. It operates on standards designed to balance safety with proportionality. As custody becomes more explicit, control over basic actions is asserted. The father's ability to communicate, to access resources, and to make arrangements is mediated by officer permission. This is standard in custodial situations, but here it underscores how quickly a call for help has transformed into a total loss of autonomy. The contrast is stark. At this stage, the encounter is no longer about preventing harm. It is about processing an arrest. The officer's demeanor reflects this shift. Efficiency replaces inquiry. Procedures replace dialogue. The human complexity of the situation recedes behind checklists and protocols. What remains is the machinery of enforcement moving forward. This progression raises important questions about proportionality and discretion. The law grants officers significant latitude in child welfare cases, precisely because stakes are high. But that discretion is meant to be exercised with restraint, calibrated to actual conditions rather than speculative fears. When discretion is driven primarily by worst-case thinking, it risks producing outcomes that are punitive rather than protective. The father's role is now almost entirely reactive. His statements are responses to accusations rather than contributions to understanding. Each attempt to reframe is met with reaffirmation of the officer's conclusions. The asymmetry of power is complete. By the end of this phase, the original incident, the locked car, feels distant. The encounter has been subsumed by a broader narrative of neglect and irresponsibility. Whether that narrative accurately reflects reality is no longer being tested in real time. It will be tested later in reports, hearings, and courtrooms. For now, the outcome is set in motion. Part 2 shows how authoritative, once asserted, seeks confirmation. It illustrates how systems prioritize narrative coherence over ongoing assessment, and how individuals caught within those systems struggle to regain footing. The decisions made here are not dramatic, but they are decisive. They ensure that the encounter cannot simply end with reassurance and departure. In the final part, we will examine how this enforcement decision resolves formally, how responsibility is transferred to other institutions, and what this case reveals about the broader structures that allow such escalations to occur to be normalized. By the time the encounter reaches its final phase, the outcome feels settled long before it is formally announced. This is one of the most revealing aspects of bodycam cases like this one. The decision point occurs earlier than viewers often realize. Arrest, charges, and eventual court resolution are not sudden developments. They are the administrative completion of a process that is already narrowed to a single path. In this final segment, responsibility shifts away from the officers on scene and into the broader institutional network. Custody is transferred. Notifications are made. Family members are contacted. Each step is presented as procedural, almost routine. The emotional gravity of what is happening to the detained parent, to the child, to the family is acknowledged. Only in passing, if at all. This is not callousness so much as compartmentalization. Systems operate by dividing complex human events into manageable tasks. The officers' language during this stage reflects that transition. Explanations become concise and definitive. The justification for arrest is summarized rather than debated. Earlier ambiguities disappear. What remains is a clean narrative suitable for reports and downstream review. This narrative emphasizes safety, risk, and necessity. It leaves little room for alternative interpretations, even though those alternatives were present earlier in the war counter. This is where institutional momentum becomes most visible. Once a case enters the enforcement pipeline, each subsequent act as supervisors, booking officers, prosecutors relies heavily on the initial framing provided by the arresting officers. While review mechanisms exist, they are rarely designed to relitigate unseen discretion absent clear misconduct. As a result, early judgments carry disproportionate weight. The family's involvement underscores this imbalance. When relatives are contacted, the situation is described in terms that reflect the officer's conclusions rather than the father's account. The event is already categorized. This framing shapes how others perceive the detained individual before they ever speak to him. Social and familial consequences ripple outward, often long before any legal adjudication occurs. From a legal perspective, the resolution of the case illustrates how enforcement decisions translate into outcomes that appear modest on paper but significant in life. Reduced charges, probation, and fines may seem proportionate when viewed abstractly, yet they rest on the foundational determination that criminal neglect occurred, a determination made in a fluid, high-pressure environment, rather than a courtroom. This raises an important analytical distinction between legality and optimality. An action can be legally defensible while still being institutionally flawed. The question is not simply whether officers could arrest under the law, but whether arrest was the most appropriate response given the totality of circumstances. Body cam analysis is uniquely positioned to interrogate that gap. In this case, the child's safety ultimately becomes managed by others' family members, caregivers, without evidence that immediate harm had occurred. This outcome complicates the narrative that arrest was the only viable protective measure. It suggests that alternatives existed, even if they were not pursued. Understanding why those alternatives were bypassed is crucial to evaluating systemic patterns. One factor is risk aversion. Modern policing operates under intense scrutiny, particularly in cases involving children. The institutional fear of failing to attend, later being blamed for that inaction, can drive officers toward maximal intervention. Arrest becomes a way to transfer risk upward and outward. Once custody is established, responsibility shifts to courts and agencies. The officer's role is complete. Another factor is training emphasis. Officers are often trained to identify hazards and liabilities, but less often trained to de-escalate parental judgment calls that do not rise to the level of abuse. When training prioritizes detection over discretion, the threshold for intervention can drop. What might once have been addressed through warning or referral becomes criminalized. The finality of the arrest also masks the complexity of the original call. The father did not attempt to conceal the situation. He initiated contact with authorities. This fact is acknowledged early but loses relevance as the encounter progresses. In enforcement logic, initial cooperation does not always mitigate perceived risk. Sometimes, it simply accelerates scrutiny. This creates a paradox that discourages future calls for help at a systemic level. This case exemplifies how welfare checks can evolve into enforcement actions without clear guardrails. Welfare checks occupy a legally ambiguous space. Officers are empowered to act in the interest of safety, but the boundaries of that authority are often undefined. Without explicit standards, discretion fills the gap. Discretion varies widely. The institutional response after the arrest further illustrates normalization. The case moves forward with little indication of internal review or reflection on whether the encounter escalated appropriately. This is not unusual. Most departments treat such outcomes as confirmation that the system worked. A risk was identified, an arrest was made, and the case proceeded through the courts. Yet normalization is precisely what makes these patterns concerning. When escalations become routine, the threshold for intervention quietly shifts. Each case sets a precedent not legally, but culturally. Officers learn what actions are supported, what decisions are rarely questioned, and where institutional backing lies. Over time, this shapes behavior more powerfully than policy manuals. The body cam footage offers a rare opportunity to slow this process down and examine it in detail. It allows viewers to see not just what happened, but how it happened, how tone shifted, how assumptions solidified, how authority was asserted incrementally rather than abruptly. These are the moments where accountability must focus, because they're the moments where different choices were still possible. Importantly, this analysis does not require concluding that the officers acted in bad faith. The more challenging and more productive question is whether the system incentivized escalation over resolution. Did the structure of authority, training, and liability push the encounter toward arrest even when less punitive options existed? The footage suggests that it did. The case's resolution in court, with reduced charges and probation, further underscores this tension. Such outcomes often reflect acknowledgement that the conduct fell into a gray area. Yet by that point, the immediate harm arrest, separation, public exposure has already occurred. Legal moderation after the fact does little to address the impact of on-scene decisions. For the child, the encounter becomes an early imprint of authority exercised in crisis. For the family, it becomes a point of rupture. For the father, it becomes a record that will follow him. These consequences are not always visible in sentencing summaries, but they are real and enduring. What this documentary ultimately reveals is not a single failure, but a pattern where help-seeking triggers enforcement, where uncertainty justifies control, and where institutional momentum carries encounters toward punitive outcomes with little opportunity for recalibration. These patterns persist not because individuals intend harm, but because systems reward closure over complexity. Body cam footage forces us to confront these dynamics without abstraction. It shows us how power is exercised in ordinary moments, how law is lived rather than written, and how quickly human situations become administrative cases. In doing so, it challenges viewers and institutions to reconsider what EG said what accountability truly requires. Accountability is not only about identifying misconduct after the fact. It is about designing systems that support proportionality, encourage discretion, and preserve space for human judgment under pressure. Without that, encounters like this will continue to follow the same arc, regardless of individual intent. This case ends, as many do, quietly, procedurally, with paperwork completed and charges resolved. But its significance lies not in its conclusion, but in its process. By examining that process in full, we gain insight into how authority operates on the ground, and how as early it can expand beyond its original purpose. That understanding is Essential, because it is only by recognizing these patterns that meaningful reform becomes possible. Not through outrage, not through simplification, but through careful, sustained analysis of how decisions are made when seconds matter and power is unevenly distributed.